Hello, good afternoon. First of all, thank you so much for turning up for a Sunday session. Thank you for coming to this satellite edition of the Asian Dramaturgs Network, hosted by ATF, Australian Theatre Forum, in association with National Arts Council and OzAsia Festival. Now, before I go any further, I'd just like to make a acknowledgement that the land we are meeting here today is the traditional lands for the Ghana people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We'd also like to acknowledge that the Ghana people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide regions, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Ghana people today. And this is quite apt for us as we start this particular satellite looking at dramaturgies of the social and the cultural. And what is even better is that there is a healthy exchange happening between Australia and Singapore. For this particular satellite, we hope that we could include more artists and more dramaturgs from different areas in Asia and beyond. Before I introduce our keynote, David Pledger, I just want to quickly talk a little bit, I'll give you an introduction to Asian Dramaturgs Network. By the way, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Hao Nian. I'm Hao Nian. And this Asian Dramaturgs Network started in 2016, where we had our first successful symposium in Singapore. I think it was in April 2016. Sorry about the dates, it's a bit blurred because we worked quite a bit in advance in terms of planning. So we started in 2016 April, where we were lucky to have quite a fruitful 3-day meetings with very notable dramaturgs, artists, performance makers from the region, Indonesia, India, Japan, China, Malaysia, Singapore, and Australia. And that was our first time meeting. And it was there that I think all of us were in the room. There was quite a huge turnout, and we all agreed that there is actually need to talk about dramaturgy. Talk about dramaturgy that has an entrenched culturally and socially specific practice and theory and frameworks that actually is separate from what we would call Western European dramaturgies. And I was interested to look at these specific regions or specific areas or cultures that may talk about dramaturgy in very different ways, but not use the term dramaturgy and dramaturg. And I think even in the first iteration during April 2016, there was a challenge, unofficial challenge going out to all of us to talk about dramaturgy without using the word dramaturgy. How do we do that in our own practice, in our own frameworks, in our own theories of the kind of performance-making skills that or experiences that we've had? And then what happened was from there, that was the first meeting where we just wanted to map out certain ideas about dramaturgies from different perspectives, a little bit country-specific, but it was from all disciplines, from theatre, dance, and even beyond. And then we had our second iteration in TPAM, Yokohama in 2016 earlier this year. 17, sorry, I'm getting my dates mixed up. In February, and that one was also quite interesting because we started to go into different thematics where we're going across genres of theatre and dance, but looking at certain kinds of issues or subjects on dramaturgy. And there was a special focus on Japanese dramaturgy, historically and from a contemporary point of view. I think it was from that one that a whole bunch of us decided, or rather looked at dramaturgy as not just performance-centric, not just project-centric, but going beyond a single project. It sort of permeated artistic lives and activities beyond a product. And we were looking at then dramaturgy as political. And what we mean by political was that the mere act of dramaturgy for me is transgressive anyway. It is an interruption. It is meant to interfere with the certain process of performance making in the most generative, productive way. And so we decided to push the idea and say, maybe for the next time when we get together, we should talk about dramaturgy in the larger picture of arts and arts making, rather than just looking at particular projects. And therefore, with the invitation going out to David Pleasure, my co-convener for this particular satellite, we sat down and we talked about possibilities of who would be interested in something like this, and who can we bring on board to talk about dramaturgy in a broader scale. That's about the nutshell of the thing. We have quite a few different speakers from different kinds of practices, and we want to include all these kinds of practices for the simple reason that dramaturgy is not these days pegged down to a certain discipline or a certain style of performance anymore. So I think I'll stop here, and I'm just going to go into our first keynote, and probably what he is going to tell us, what David will tell us, will give us a sense of what to expect in the next 1.5 days of how we are trying to approach or look at dramaturgy or reflect on it. Yeah. So I think for quite a few of us, David doesn't need any introduction really, but David Pleasure is a contemporary artist and curator working within and between performing, visual and media arts in Australia. I have to read this because it's quite comprehensive and quite detailed. And his works have been done in Australia, and he's worked in Asia and Europe. His live performances, installations, interactive artworks, documentaries, digital art, and discursive events are notable for engaging publics in productive and provocative ways. From his initial practice, live performance, he has developed a cross-disciplinary dramaturgy in which a central platform is engaging with artists across art forms and experts from social, scientific, and academic fields. I think he will definitely elaborate on this when he talks about some of his projects and beyond that. So for now, I'm just going to leave it here, and I'm going to pass it to David. David?
Thanks, Hao Nin. Thank you. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people of today. And on the subject of Adelaide, I'd also like to convey my commiserations to all those Adelaide Crows supporters who followed the game yesterday. I was in your corner, but as often is the way in both sport and art, momentum overwhelms quality. And that's what I reckon happened yesterday, because the Adelaide Crows are an absolutely gun team, but Richmond had the momentum through the final series. So I have to go back to Melbourne and face the Tigers supporters. For this event, I'd also like to thank Centre 42, and in particular Yan Ling and Casey and Daniel, who in my experience always go above and beyond what it takes financially and logistically to present these often influential meetings in various countries. So this is now the third, following on from Singapore and Japan, and this time in association with the ATF and the support of OzAsia Festival and the National Arts Council of Singapore, who should get a big mention here. Here we are, Adelaide, the Asian Dramaturgs Network first satellite meeting in Australia. The network's really a very interesting configuration of artists and cultural operators from Asia, a configuration which in this instance includes Australia, and sometimes configurations of Asia do not include Australia. For me, and this is my third time because I started out in Singapore, the ADN is really quite a unique proposition. It's like a mobile laboratory that reformulates its intentions in response to local conditions. So its ambitions are to make a contribution to thinking about the arts and arts practice regionally and internationally by not limiting or prescribing propositions and definitions. And I think Hao Nin really kind of framed that very well in terms of trying to have a very open idea around the idea of dramaturgy, because the aim of it is to create a genuinely experimental space for thought and action in each place, in each location. And I have been kindly credited as co-convener of the platform, although my time actually has been restricted to some very enjoyable plotting and consultative sessions with my friend, who's really done all the work and who's graciously allowed me to accept a little of the glory. So thank you. Now, the first time I heard the word dramaturg, I was barely 20 years old and on a tour of a theatre with an eclectic bunch of reprobates attempting to pass themselves off as artists, myself included. One of our party was a playwright called Roger Pulvers. I don't know if any of you come across Roger Pulvers. He's pretty much based in Japan, has been for a while. But he'd recently come back from Europe, and he used the words dramaturg countless times during the tour, as if we all knew what it meant, and appeared mortified at our ignorance when actually we declared we did not. And whilst it was pretty impossible to ignore the referred cultural snobbery in his reaction, I have to admit that as a group, we were all somewhat seduced by the word, you know, as it sounded just a little bit dirty. Dramaturg, you know, is a bit illicit. And I remember making a mental note to myself that I really should find out what that word dramaturg actually means. And some 30 years later, I've still got absolutely no idea. Which is why I'm not going to talk about dramaturgs today. I'm going to do the session here on something that I feel that I have a little bit more authority over, and that's dramaturgy. So I'm not going to talk about dramaturgs, I'm going to talk about dramaturgy. And just to be clear, when I talk about dramaturgy, I'm not actually talking about the various activities of the dramaturg, although I am talking about something not altogether unrelated, but which operates in multiple spaces simultaneously. And just to keep your interest up a little bit, whilst the word dramaturgy is certainly not a dirty word, there is something potentially illicit in its usage. A disclaimer before I forge ahead is that everything I say today is provisional. Even if my delivery and tone smacks of certitude at times, it is there only to frame the discussion sufficiently to amplify its quality through your responses and feedback. So, to kick us off, I'd like to ask myself a question. Who am I and what do I do? So my answer is that I am an artist, and what I do is I work at making things. All the other activities I work at, producing, curating, public commentary, arts advocacy, stem from my artistic practice. And some of these I do within my company, not yet it's difficult, and some I do outside the company structure. This framing is quite important for me because it leads me to the matter at hand, dramaturgy. Because for me, dramaturgy has always been about how a thing works, whether it's a work of art or the world itself. So for me, dramaturgy, it's quite a useful concept. It's flexible in as much as it can be transposed into different meanings depending on the artistic context, and it can have meaningful value when applied outside the arts. And that's what really interests me. For some time now, I've been prosecuting the idea of dramaturgy as an operating system in the circle of artistic practice, and also its application to cultural and social circles. And today I'm going to unpack this trajectory from artistic dramaturgy to the stratospheric heights of culture and society. 10 years ago in Australia, the Prime Ministership of John Howard came to an end. His time was marked by what I would call a corruption of public discourse, during which he waged a culture war that carved the Australian polity into rigid discursive units, the consequences of which continue to resonate deeply in Australia's culture. It marked the beginning of a long-term project of mine to insinuate progressive ideas from artistic practice into the national conversation by valorising the language of contemporary practice in discussions inside and outside the realm of the arts. Open, inclusive, and underscored by a desire for discovering new ways of working, creating and making, the language of contemporary arts practice has the flexibility required to deal with change and experiment, and which, if introduced into an amplified discursive space, has the potential to expand the quality and depth of civic discourse and civil action. It is, of necessity, a language of progress. Central to my notion of dramaturgy is the idea that an artwork is generated by an operating system driven by random and non-deterministic algorithms that are entered and extracted by human agency. In applying the concept of dramaturgy more broadly, it reveals itself to be an adaptive notion that it can embrace the idea of an operating system of culture or an operating system of society. Because at its core is the element of change. In fact, dramaturgy is defined by change, and the value of thinking of it as an operating system is determined by its capacity to be altered by a creative and evolutionary process driven by the algorithms of human behaviour. I've actually been quite influenced in thinking about this by the Belgian political theorist Chantal Mouffe. And she wrote, "What's needed in the current situation is a widening of the field of artistic intervention, with artists working in a multiplicity of social spaces, outside traditional spaces, in order to oppose the program of the total social mobilisation of capitalism." So my response has been to argue that we need to develop not only an artistic dramaturgy and a cultural dramaturgy, but a progressive social dramaturgy. And I'd like to map that out from my artistic dramaturgy to a social project over a couple of projects. So when I think of dramaturgy in an artistic context, I think of it as the process of connecting and matting ideas into practice. It operates in a way that's really fixed. It's necessarily adaptive, partly because of its reliance on collective, collaborative actions, which are inherently resistant to the concretisation and commodification of other practice-related words like creativity and innovation, words which have largely been voided of their meaning. In the context of the work of Not Yet It's Difficult, I'd like to map out for you the main way in which we work, how we operate. And I'd like to emphasise here that we have other ways of operating that have different shapes, different speeds and different frequencies, but the way I'm going to describe to you now is what I would call our signature dramaturgy. Okay, so we start with an idea. I don't have any loyalty to any art forms. I can't see the lines between things, and I don't have any loyalty to artistic configuration. So the idea is the centrepiece, the agent of motion in the creation of the artwork or the event. So how an idea emerges from a group of artists that work closely together, it's quite difficult to identify. And I'm just going to give you my version of it because my other collaborators would probably give you their versions of it as well. So this is the very provisional part. So usually the kernel of the idea is generated by a curiosity that I would bring to the table, but which has grown out of artistic and discursive contexts that have history within the company. So a series of conversations that may have built up, over years and suddenly kind of materialise or manifest in an idea, and I propose that, and then that gets unpacked. This dynamic changes actually depending on the people who gravitate towards the company. So in the early days when there was a core group of founding members working on every project, for example our dramaturg Peter Eckersall and technical manager Paul Jackson, the dynamic was actually much more centralised. And these days it's much more distributed as the NYD diaspora is quite extensive and artists are called on or put their hand up for specific projects. So these days I work a lot with Natalie Curcio, who's a choreographer and performance maker in her own right, and Todd McDonald, who's an actor and the artistic director of La Boîte in Queensland. They sort of tend to feature quite regularly in our artistic adventures at the moment. So we begin with an idea, and then we invite a group of people to talk to us who know more about the idea than we do. So they might be experts or academics or just people with specific related experience. As we gather information, we then invite a second group to respond to what we've been told and what we're thinking about what we've been told. And then we get a third group who help moderate this information through the filter of our originating idea. So that's our dramaturgy. Generative systems that operate within concentric circles of action and activity. So concentric circles have proved to me to be both quite a useful image and a mechanism. In practice, though, there can be quite a lot of overlapping in terms of personnel and agency and knowledge, and really, for the most part, it's quite messy. So I won't kind of pretend that that the lines don't, bend and intersect, because they do. But circles are very interesting for me because, as I mentioned, I don't really see the lines between art forms, and also actually as a citizen I don't really see the lines between art or society or human behaviour. They're all fluid, and I really haven't discovered merit in keeping things separate. In fact, quite the opposite. Separations always seem to be about territory and therefore power. And I believe in the interconnectedness of things at all times, in all circumstances, and it's why I like circles actually. Circles are lines that resolve. And when resolved, they tend to emanate rather than demonstrate. Vibration rather than static silos. Probably the most concrete early example of this process in play for Not Yet As Difficult was a couple of productions, K and Blowback, which we did in the early noughties. The K was a sort of a response to the crackdown on civil liberties in the aftermath of 9/11 and sort of conflated Kafka's The Trial and Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 and George Orwell's 1984 all into one big explosion. And the other piece was Blowback, which riffs off Chalmers Johnson's book of the same name and tracks a guerrilla resistance to an Australia that had been militarily occupied by America in the not too distant future. So, I mean, we really didn't know a lot about the kind of social architecture around this material. So we brought into the process a fairly diverse set of knowledges and experiences. So, for example, in Blowback, we had what we called a 2-week reading period. So we brought in a professor of divinity, a neoconservative journalist, a national security expert, and an anthropologist who specialised in talking about racism and multiculturalism and nationalism. And they all brought to the project a world that we were all quite unfamiliar with. And also, really importantly, using languages that were not our own. And they spoke to a revolving group of collaborators, including actors and dramaturgs and technical staff. And I want to say, really importantly for our process, having people who work in the technical aspect of the production, they are absolutely centrifugal to the whole way that we think, simply because often they get marginalised, but we like to bring them into the process because they actually think a bit differently. They think very tangentially. In the first instance, Blowback was a writing project, and it was my task to process the ideas into some sort of dramatic literature that could also serve as a score, which I could conduct as a director using discrete sound, image, spatial and corporeal elements. And it also needed to be an artefact that could be used by all the makers of the work: actors, performers, film and sound editors, designers and production staff. So I wrote the script as I was listening to our experts talking and our collaborators processing and our company members proposing artistic responses to the swirl of new ideas. 3 circles of engagement emanating outwards and reverberating inwards, amplifying the originating idea. What I became aware of was that our operating system, our dramaturgy, as a company was being reconfigured in the operating system of the production. So how we worked as a company actually became the way in which the production worked. And it's a transpositional process that became normative for us and that enabled us to develop and understand the mechanism for 2970, the boiling point, which we've recently become known for, which sits in the social dramaturgy space and which is where I'm heading to. I'll talk about that towards the end, actually. Just to kind of frame it for you and to kind of put an idea in your head as we head that way, 2970 is, depending on the audience, variously described as a festival of ideas and art, a durational event, or for this audience, if you don't mind, I will assume that you'll be happy to hear how I describe it, as a biennial happening. I'm going to just park it to one side for a bit and just talk a little to the notion of cultural dramaturgy and the role of the arts, or lack thereof, in the operating systems of our culture as I get to talking about social dramaturgy. So a major tendency, I think, in the current formulation of our discussions around culture is the marginalisation and compartmentalisation of the arts as a thing in and of itself, as opposed to a thing in and of itself connected to other things. So this lack of relational thinking really exposes the arts in policy settings, in funding settings, and most poignantly, in social settings. Now, the reasons for the isolation of the arts are multifarious and specific to history and geography, and they operate in varying degrees according to these and many other factors. And in Australia, I suppose, you know, we've often thought that we have such a kind of real tradition of anti-intellectualism, and that may be that there is something in the fact that the arts is isolated or marginalised as a consequence of that anti-intellectualism. But I want to make a bigger play here. I want to say that the arts are integral to theoretical and practical formations of democracy in a period where democracy is under siege from the ascendant ideology, neoliberalism. So it's necessary to isolate the arts, one of the main ways democracy expresses itself, in order to disable democracy, which neoliberal capitalism must do, because democracy disrupts its singular focus on profit maximisation. Democracy and the arts disrupt the flow of neoliberal capitalism by valorising access, equity, sustainability, and justice, all of which consume time and labour, the two essential elements in the growth of unfettered capital. So that's a problem for the arts. And I think it's very hard not to perceive the recent attacks on the Australia Council for the Arts by the current government through that prism, through that ideological prism. So we need to resist this push, this sort of push towards isolating the arts. And my argument in this space over the last few years has been to propose attack as the best form of defence. Attack by way of bringing the arts into the centre of the national conversation. We don't fully understand the workings of politics or media or sport or health and education sectors until we see them in relation to each other. And that's the task of culture. To create a system that shapes these relationships, constructs meaning out of them, and folds them back on us, a process through which we create our identity. And the language that is currently employed to shape these relationships and create these connections is the language of managerialism, of productivity, of efficiency, and that is the language of culture these days. And that's why it's a bit sick. In Australia, and my sense is, and in fact I know we are not alone here, the operating system of our cultural dramaturgy is in desperate need of a new language. And my proposition is that we turn to a very logical place, which is the language of the arts and artistic practice. So how might that work? Okay, I'm going to give you an example from the work of Not Yet It's Difficult. But from 2011 to 2014, we developed a project called Ampersand, which was a research and development lab that sought to develop a new artistic language across music, dance and performance by using as its foundation the body listening protocols which we'd been developing for some 20 years. So body listening operates on the premise that all properly functioning bodies have a sense of physical presence, proprioception, which when amplified confers a heightened sense of awareness on itself and the external world, sometimes called exteroception. So the process of amplification through a refined set of exercises cultivates a capacity for sensing shifts in the space without seeing or hearing them. So in this way, it was quite a deep artistic exploration and inquiry into the practices of listening with our body. So throughout the 4 years of the project, it took place in Germany, Australia and Korea, we became aware that some of the artistic inquiry actually begged to be unpacked in contexts other than performance research. So we developed a model for international artistic collaboration that placed artistic practice at the centre of broader cultural conversations. We wanted to understand how culture might operate when you place artistic practice at its centre rather than as an add-on or a thing to be fetishised or projected on or as a diversion for foreign businessmen trying to close a deal at the embassy. So we offered ancillary events to our research and public performance program that directly arose out of the artistic inquiry of sending and receiving information with our bodies in a heightened state of listening. We offered a public workshop in body listening. We held a seminar by invitation called Not Just K-pop, which looked at the reverberations of the Korean wave on global culture. And we presented a large public forum called Asia plus Europe equals Australia. I like equations. Which featured the Belgian ambassador, the EU ambassador to Australia, and the director of AsiaLink Arts, talking from their respective positions on Australia's policy and behaviours in Asia and the EU. Each iteration, the public performance, the workshop, the seminar and forum, had distinct audiences and were generated as a set of concentric circles emanating out of our artistic inquiry. Now, on their own, none of these elements are exceptional. Many of us, do these, as a matter of course when formulating our artistic projects, as we had been doing for some years as well. However, as a project that emanated outward from the originating artistic idea, that of the exploration of listening with the body, it stuck as a novel way of approaching the question of how culture operates, that is, through the impetus of artistic practice. For example, one of the more telling foldbacks we got was from the EU ambassador to Australia in the forum Asia plus Europe equals Australia. And he remarked on the deficit of Australia's capacity to listen to Asia in the foreign policy space. Translated through a body listening paradigm, Australia's policy default setting with Asia was all about sending information and not receiving it, and not even listening for it. So in this way, the language of our artistic practice had resonated in a kind of foreign policy context, and it gave me a real appetite to discover how we might develop this trajectory even further. So before I do so and talk about social dramaturgy, I want to add a big whacking coda here, which is that for many years, I and many people have considered that the culture of Australia's First Nations people represents best practice operating principles for good reason, because Indigenous culture emanates concentric circles of knowledge, and it does not separate art from culture nor culture from society. It is an astonishingly good template for the operation of culture, and it motivated me to invite as the opening keynote speaker for 2970 The Boiling Point, Indigenous elder Kyle Slab, to riff on the relationships between art, culture and society in the frame of a discussion about practicing democracy, which is what the name of the last edition, which just happened a month ago, of 2970 Boiling Point was. Actually, it does pain me to say this, but I actually think of the arts as one of the most conservative sectors of Australian society. Mentally progressive, professionally conservative. One of the revelations I had during 2970, the last one, was understanding the different contexts of progressive and conservative. There was a young high school student there. We had about 30 or more at 2970, and he stood up at the end and he said, "I'm a conservative." After which he gave this big rave about how much he loved being at this event, because people didn't shout at him like they did at school whenever he aired his conservative views. And when he was raving, literally raving, it dawned on me that whilst his views were conservative, his attitude was progressive. He was really prepared to have his mind changed, and in fact was most interested in being challenged to change his mind. In Australia, and I think particularly the arts here, there are a lot of people who identify as progressive, but for whom change is anathema, something to fear and resist. It explains the inertia I often feel when I'm in arts contexts. And I really don't mean artistic contexts. I don't feel that. I mean arts sector contexts. Change usually refers to so in these contexts, change usually refers to changing the people who are in charge, rather than systemic or values change. And I'm really talking here about the arts sector, okay? How it behaves in relation to itself and in relation to other sectors. Its lack of interconnectedness is actually remarkable. So the inertia of the arts sector was one of the motivating factors for me to develop 2970 The Boiling Point, which is a discursive context in which the arts and artistic practice can operate progressively as a language of change. I should explain to you, 2970, it's actually 2970 degrees, 2,970 degrees, which is the boiling point of gold. because it takes place on the Gold Coast. There you go. The event really was conceived as an alchemy of art and ideas, which was essentially a cultural provocation based on, not yet its difficult, signature dramaturgy. So just to reiterate, take an idea, bring a bunch of people to the table who know more about the idea or its related parts than you do, invite responses from a diverse group of thinkers across sectors, and develop that content from opinion to argument to action. In the case of an artistic dramaturgy, that action is the production of an artwork. In the case of cultural dramaturgy, it may be considered the production of collective meaning. In the case of a social dramaturgy, at least in the most recent edition of 2970, it's the production of a law or a set of laws. In 2017, the idea for 2970 was around practicing democracy in an age when its value and agency is in question. So, the concentric circles created by this idea, when dropped into the 2970 pool, were represented first by 4 keynote speakers. So I mentioned Kyle Slab. Then there was Hiroshi Shiguro, who's a Japanese roboticist. Van Badham, who's a cultural commentator, and Julian Assange, who came in from his small room in London. So we invited these 4 keynote speakers to create a picture of the world they contribute to as a path to proposing a future they wish to live in. So each speaker was invited to ask the 2970 delegates to vote on a law, or we used another word, protocol, they believe will help their future to be made. So that's the first circle, the keynotes. Each keynote's provocation was amplified by 2 respondents, which created a triangle of content that was processed by delegates at the round tables, which was the third circle, so the keynotes, the respondents, and the delegates. And this process was moderated and facilitated by a curated group of moderators to the point where each delegate voted for or against the law. So the architecture and the process of 2970 is basically an amplified version of our artistic dramaturgy and our attempt at creating a cultural dramaturgy as outlined in the Ampersand project. So it was the second edition, Practicing Democracy. The first one was called The Future is Here. So that was the provocation for 2015. This time it was Practicing Democracy. And there were significant developments from the first to the second that I'd like to frame within my overarching notion of dramaturgy as an operating system driven by random and non-deterministic algorithms entered and extracted by human agency. So in our artistic dramaturgy, we actually, this sort of phrase around random and non-deterministic algorithms, we have another word for it. It's called free radicals. So we often deliberately introduced into our operating system when we're making artwork a free radical, an unknown element that could act as an agent of chaos or order depending on how it was invited and ingested in the system. For 2970, the algorithm we entered was young people, because in the first edition we had a very modest representation from this cohort. So we invited 30 or more high school students and about 20 university students to be directly involved in 3 different modes. Firstly, as roundtable participants, so basically speaking at the round table. Secondly, as members of the Fourth Estate, which was a media group gifted the task of reporting on and critiquing the event. And thirdly, as members of an international collaboration between the local Robina State High School and 2 performance groups, some you might know Sipat Lawin from the Philippines and Shock Therapy from the Gold Coast. So here's a little taste of how introducing that bit of code into our operating system worked.
are going to create the future democracy. We are the deciders on what's going to happen. So I feel like this is helping to educate us into what we will be having to do, and like we need to see all these different points of views, because when just in school and everything, we aren't taught enough. And I feel like we need to be involved in more things like this to understand what we need to develop for the future.
Incredible ability to have such a rigorous conversation with very diverse points of view, which is completely blowing my mind actually, and it's very rare that this kind of conversation happens. You kind of get stuck in your own way of thinking about things, and then in this environment to be in a space where you're completely put in an opportunity to think completely differently, but then also being around a table of people that are also potentially thinking so dramatically different to me, it's good. It's unsettling, but good.
I think that this is just like a great opportunity to see all the different people, like different ages, different cultures, different perspectives, talking on the most important issues that we're facing today as an Australian society.
Hard one, but I think Van, that just spoke, has probably been my favourite, just because she was really provocative in what she was saying. So not only were you getting the questions that were kind of initiating a debate, but she responded to all of them really confidently, and that's obviously from like a drama student perspective, that's something that we all like wish to encompass going into the future.
Leave that up. Sorry for the people like me who get really annoyed about those cursor clicks that go on the screen while the video's playing. One of the things that came out of the that whole experience was I had a number of people, older people who, architects and business people, said, I'm not going to do any more projects unless I've got young people involved. It's changed the way that I've actually think about how to do business, or think about how the way that I think about designing a building, or changes the way that I think about how I make a show. There was another element in the whole process, another algorithm that was entered. Actually, it was sort of like rewriting the code from the first time, which was the moderators. So unlike other such provocations, 2970 is a contest of ideas in which the protagonists are not the speakers, but the delegates, the participants. So the role of the moderators is quite crucial in terms of processing the sort of triangle of information that are provided by the speakers and respondents, and enabling the delegates to voice their opinions and shape it into an argument on which they could then base a decision for voting. So the object of the whole exercise was not to reach a consensus. It was very much not to reach a consensus, but for each delegate to arrive at a decision through the moderation process. So for example, one of the first laws, Kyle Slabb's law, was because he was talking about Indigenous culture as a template for democracy. His law was, I wish to propose that the elimination of all hierarchy from society. So people took that on board. There were 2 respondents to what he said. That information, that triangle of content then went to the table, and then Kyle would then go around to each of the tables as well, because people wanted to know more about what he was talking about, what he was proposing. And then the moderators would their job was to really kind of know when to lead and know when to follow the conversation, so that the group of people, which was the delegate population, was very intergenerational, it's cross-sectoral and cross-cultural, how they could kind of bring everybody to the point where they would make a decision and make a vote, and then the votes were tabled. His surprisingly for some people, that law only just got passed, about 60-40. There was a whole expectation. But I think that was incredibly good, because what it meant that there was a sort of a very strong representation across the progressive to the conservative, and how something like that actually, brings one's politics out onto the table in a space where people can respectfully disagree with each other, and in a spirit of productive criticism, which were essentially what the rules of the engagement were about. thing about the moderators was, and that's something that just before I finish up, I'd like to kind of frame, is that their agency really needed to be unified by humanist values, by a capacity for empathy and a strong intuition. And it was in this group that the language of the arts and artistic practice is embedded in 2970, because all of them were artists or cultural operators that had come from around Australia and who were very well versed in arts practice, but also had a kind of were confident enough not to have to be a voice at the table, but to actually kind of be a filter for the people who were really whose voices we were trying to encourage to be heard at the table. So it's not visible, this kind of dramaturgical intent, but it's very evident. And it's here where I think that the Not Yet It's Difficult dramaturgy, this signature dramaturgy, really sort of became a profoundly humanist enterprise. So in thinking our way through this trajectory, we've been asking ourselves, we just finished the last one 2 weeks ago, so it's all fresh. We've sort of been asking ourselves, what is it? Is this an artistic event that we are doing? And maybe it follows Chantal Mouffe's instruction, and that it's an intervention, an artistic intervention in a social space. Or perhaps it's more of a conflation of the two, a social intervention, one that's generated by a singular artistic process in which the arts amplifies and also contests its discursive agency, and in which the language of the arts is the language of interaction. It's designed to expand the quality and depth of civic discourse and action by concentrating on the basic tasks of proposing, processing, talking and listening with a group of people who don't know each other and who get together to contest ideas in the spirit of productive criticism and disagreement to respectfully disagree. So these rules of engagement have been devised through years-long artistic practice and are projected out of an artistic impetus, which is to discover the act of listening in the art of democracy. I might just leave it there, and then we can talk about some other things if you would like.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, David. Just before we open it up for discussion, I'm quite struck by a few points, and maybe I'll ask you a question or two. The first one I kept hearing, or I kept thinking, was the notion of democracy through corporate reality. This idea of listening, that it's more visceral, and it's more granular, and it doesn't come from these overarching structures of justice or law. Could you perhaps comment on that?
So I will kind of approach that from the idea of noise and silence and signal. So neoliberalism creates noise to disable democracy, and it creates noise in institutional spaces, in media spaces, and in political spaces, and it's overwhelming, and most of us actually can't hear any of the signals anymore. If you go to the body, and that's one of the things with the body listening protocols, where you basically get taken through a whole process where you reduce the noise in your own body so that you can send and receive very basic intentions in a group of people in the one space. What you understand then is that there is if you like, a dramaturgy of humanity, an operating system of humanity in which the relationships between people, if they are disrupted, they will corrupt the expressions of that temporary ecology of people in those exercises, which when amplified becomes a society. So one of the arguments that one of the things that I propose in terms of having an antidote to that noise that is created is actually to engage in a process which is at the centre of body listening, which is that you are in a space with other people and your concentration is really only about your own presence in that space and the presence of other people in that space, and having a relationship which is not about seeing or hearing them, but is actually about sensing them. And if that is lost, then actually the capacity to create a democracy is lost.
How does that fit or feed into a project like The Boiling Point, where you get this group of young people together? It feels as if this vibration that you're talking about from the concentric circle idea, where there are these moderators you were talking about, who come with their own rich experiences, and then you said the word filter. But it also sounds to me that these moderators are, in a way, perhaps giving off their own vibrations that are then received by these young people. And when I say vibration here, from the intellect and from this body of thinking, the body of thinking, body of listening. And there seems to be a two-way thing happening. Is that how you would look at it to a certain degree?
Yeah, I think there's something in that, and it's actually in one of the things that Kyle Slab talked to me about, right? You know, and I sort of I talk to him quite a lot these days, and he talked a lot about listening in terms of culture, and you know, I think it certainly would talk about it in a much more complex way than I talk about it. But in respect to that, I think a lot of the conversations that I had with him actually began to help me develop a language which I was able to communicate to the moderators about the whole idea of what the practice of listening actually meant, and that there's a great phrase which is that sometimes listening is about not speaking up, and to actually that silence is not something to be afraid of. And to allow people to trust their own processing so that they can arrive at things in their own rhythms. And I think there you're talking about, when you start talking about rhythm, you're always talking about sound.
Thank you. Just another point that I picked up, which to me again was very interesting, is we were talking about dramaturgies of the social, and the approach that you have, even starting with NYID, of gathering these different authorities or experts in their fields, already sounds very much like a very rich dramaturgy of social sciences, bringing together different strands of social sciences to build a base for the work. And this model or this idea gets translated into an event like this. So for this particular one, I guess, listening to how you invited these 4 keynote speakers, right? Where is the dramaturgy in that, or where is the curation, or how did these 4 people come together for you?
It was actually about the listening challenge that each of them presented. So, for example, Kyle is Kyle, you sort of can just sit and listen to him for a long time, and you absorb his sensibility as much through what he's saying, the language that he says. So there's like an osmotic process that's going on. Van Badham, who actually replaced Jamila Rizvi, she's like a knife that just kind of goes straight to you. So that's a very different experience. And Ishiguro is, he will kind of go this way and he'll go that way, and sometimes you pick up this and sometimes you pick up that. And Julian is, he is a noise machine. So he's really somebody who, in the kind of public sphere, creates an enormous amount of noise. And the challenge that I wanted to give to the delegates was to see whether or not they could hear his signal through the noise that was created around him before they actually listened to him in the event. Because actually, in the keynote, he's incredibly methodical, and step by step by step by step, and it takes you further away from how you think things are. But the noise when you go into that space, when you get into it, before you actually sit down and listen to him, is really quite difficult to sort of... So I wanted to provide different challenges to the audience with each of the speakers, not just about the content, but also about what they what they represented.
Thank you. Which is quite fascinating when you talk about this expert in robotics speaking in these meandering, rounded fashion, and then someone from the arts going right for the kill.
Yeah.
That's quite a challenge actually in
Well,
putting
Van
them
Batten
together.
identifies as a unionist as well, so she's got that kind of Tammany Hall sort of approach to things.
So on that note, I would really like to open this to the floor where we can then perhaps comments, feedback, questions. Yeah, I think we have mic going round. Yeah, please. It has been quite a actually very rich, and yeah, it does. There's time is needed, I guess. But anyone to start it off? Okay, we're having problems. Start. Charles, you have a question.
I just thank you, David, very much. I just wanted you to do more. Sorry, thank you, David, for the mic. I just wanted you to, if I could, ask you to do a bit more about that whole notion of this is provisional, and therefore, at the beginning you said all I'm saying is then dependent on how we respond, etc., etc. If you could say a little bit more about that, or provoke us more to do the part or to participate in making alive that provisionality that you proposed.
Well, the name of my company is Not Yet It's Difficult, so everything's provisional. So what is clear today is not clear tomorrow, and in a way, I think that is a form of resistance in a world in which what's demanded of you is to take a side every single day, and to have an opinion that never leads to argument and a decision. So rather than be authorial, I'd really prefer to kind of, take a propositional approach, and I don't mean that everything I didn't say I don't absolutely believe 100%, because I do, and I have some certainty about things, but at the same time, I would never want to be in a position where that certainty is resistant to change and challenge.
So if I can just continue. So in the operating system, this provisionality or this working force of things being provisional, I mean, I can see how that occurs in the free radicals that are coming up and how they interject. But in a concentric circle kind of image,
where do the free radicals?
or how do you envisage these movements, rhythms, listenings that are provoking a stronger sense of the provisional, which we tend to resist? I agree with you, and and how to unpack it in a way is what I'm asking.
I suppose the thing that comes up with me with that question is that, and it's something that I've really kind of changed in the way that I think about things, which is the sort of concentric circles actually I see as being quite flat and non-hierarchical, and at some point I think the sort of movement away from the kind of demonstrative silo has been really about trying to develop something that was simple and not as complicated. Doesn't mean not complex, but not as complicated. And so and I think it's one of the reasons why I really like, when you go into a kind of social dramaturgy, I talk about things like algorithms as opposed to free radicals, because free radicals are really more to do with the artistic dramaturgy, and algorithms are actually more to do with the social dramaturgy. So, you know, the idea for the space of 2970 to introduce, you know, young people into that space, that was a very deliberate thing, not just because, I mean, you all know when you work with institutions, almost everything is determined by marketing. So it wasn't about marketing, it was actually about a need to create a kind of temporary ecology that was more representative of the world that people would return to after the event. And so in that kind of space of the concentric circle, the sort of the algorithm, which is the free radical in the artistic dramaturgy, is actually much more of it's actually much more to do with people than it is to do with anything architectural. And I guess what the way that I answer that question is a really good example of how provisional, because I'm still thinking about this as I go. There's nothing, there's nothing concrete in it at all. When you kind of formulate a chronology, there's a falsity in every chronology. And I think as artists, we really, really know that that's the case, and that those constructs are extremely important for us to use to examine and debate and go forward when we make our work. But sometimes the actual logic of it, concreteness of it, is, well, as an artist, I don't work that way. If the concreteness is decided by other people, not by me, even though I, have a certainty about what I'm doing at every given moment, the moment passes. And I guess that's what the comment about provisional means.
Thank you. I want to ask, not a follow-up question, the form or of what you've presented today as practicing dramaturg for me at the most basic level in performance projects. When I enter into discussion with the performance maker, I actually make it a point to tell the person, can we be specific with the language? Mm-hmm. Be specific with the words we use, because we may be speaking in English, but there are certainly some cultural shifts. And for this is a very, for me, an interesting study of language, of how you have actually, well, I guess appropriate is the wrong word here, but use these seemingly scientific words actually and plot it onto a model, a system of an artistic system, a dramaturgical system that is not rigid at all, even though with the implications of these concentric circles, that it's organic. It still goes back to being very organic and fluid. So I guess the question is, this was in the making, or this kind of a thought, notion, idea, theory came with the practice of NYID already. When did this particular use of language or vocabulary, you think, came about? When did this start to percolate?
Look, honestly, I think it was when I just got so sick of hearing, leaders speak in a certain way, in which carved out spaces that either I was not part of or friends of mine were not part of. And that's really, I think, the culture wars that started with Howard. So I think from that point on, what a kind of thing to say, I'm going to, change the national conversation by introducing the language of the arts and artistic practice into it. But I think that is a really important ambition to have, because the fact that the language that are used these days is so reactionary and not progressive, well, I won't use that word, and not languages of progress. And one of the things that I've tried to do, because unless you try something, you never really know whether or not it's going to work. So about 2 months ago, somebody commissioned me to write a piece called The Dramaturgy of Universal Basic Income. And for an article earlier this year, I started to talk about the dramaturgy of football, that it's the playbook of football. Particularly, I was talking about American football. The playbook of American football is essentially its operating system, its dramaturgy, how the thing operates, how it works. So I was really interested in, taking these sorts of ideas, and not just in a configuration like 2970, but as a sort of a public commentator, to try out whether or not these words that we use that are quite effective and kind of open up spaces for us as artists and working in the arts, whether or not you could actually take that out into non-art spaces and see how people reacted. And it's always the case. It's always the case for me. People will always be much smarter than you think they are, or that you're told that they are. People will kind of go for it. So one of the places that I work in is I work in a social change agency as a sort of artist in residence, which is not really what I do there at all. But and I started to sort of talk about these things to them, and they're very well connected with wealth and programs. They're a very interesting agency actually. And so I talked to them about the whole idea of dramaturgy, and they just nodded their heads and they went, "Yeah, I get that." And so I think one of the things that that we actually should be a lot more confident about is if we really think things carefully, and if we really study language and kind of understand its power, that actually you can take these ideas into a much broader, into society, and people will actually go, "Oh, that's a very interesting way of thinking a problem that I've been completely stuck on for so long." And I don't think we should be shy about it. I think we should really be, very brave and ambitious. I mean, as artists, we all know what failure is. I mean, failures, you've got to embrace failure if you have any kind of success in your working life. So I think that's taking that out into that space and, trusting that, people will laugh at you. They may do, but the next time you'll work out why and you'll change it and it'll get better.
Thank you. Do we have any follow-up questions? Everyone's deep in thought, I think. It looks that way to me from here. I hope so. I'm going to say we'll stop here for a simple reason that there's been a slight glitch in actually the next scheduling, right? Or rather, we will go on to the next part, which is at 3:50, yeah? So that gives us time to grab a coffee, and maybe if we start clumping and talking without the mic, something will happen there. But thank you so much for that, David, and please help me to thank David.
Thank you.